Unlike my office on campus, I'm at liberty to use the full panoply of Type 56 teaching materials without getting proned out at gunpoint. Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of the SKS and AK-47 in China. I'm Jason Clower. This is a course about why the PLA deliberately kept obsolescent weapons, like the SKS carbine. When people think about small arms, like we do on this channel, Air forces are not usually the first branch of service that anyone thinks of. But of course, in this discerning audience, many of you out there will know much better than I do that the M16 got its start in US service from the US Air Force, not the US Army, which picked it up later to replace its disappointing M14. Coincidentally, at that very time, China was having its own struggles with a near twin of the M14 project, which we'll be discussing in Act 2 of this course. And we're going to pay particular attention because I have a particular forlorn love for the tragic romance of the Type 63 rifle, a gorgeous rifle that deserved so much better than it got.
莫名我就喜欢你，深深地爱上你。
That's a story for another day. The PLA-AF, as they're known, are going to come up again and again in our story. Also, because part of our story is going to revolve around the closest thing that the PLA ever had to inter-service rivalry, we need to introduce the birth of the PLA Air Force. Let's begin by noting the name. The People's Liberation Army Air Force. It's in the name. The Air Force belongs to the Army. Within the PLA heritage, the Air Force and the Navy have always been appendages to the land force, in as much as they're part of the war plan in the emerging Chinese doctrine that we'll be studying quite shortly, was explicitly as something like a speed bump to slow down the enemy, probably consisting of US Marines and US Army forces and or nationalist forces from Taiwan, to slow down the tidal wave of enemy forces that would hit the coast and begin a land war on China. That land war and the army that would fight it was always the crown jewel in every version of China's Great War Plan. However, even before the Korean War, all parts of the Chinese defense establishment understood that they had crossed a very important watershed when they took over control of the entire mainland. The difference was they had gone from being an oppositional insurgent force to a force that now had to hold and defend a subcontinental country. So, when the Chinese Communist Party finally established control over the mainland in 1949 in what they called liberation, they understood very clearly that they now had to leave behind their insurgency days, at least on a strategic level. They were now finally committed to holding ground and defending it. And they understood, even before the Korean War, where they really got their first taste of being on the receiving end of modern air power and did not like it one bit, even then, they understood that they needed to establish whatever buffer forces over air and sea that they could to serve as something like cushioning that would soften the blow, like the plastic crumple body on a modern automobile that's designed to be smashed under impact, but protect the occupants of the vehicle as much as possible. To that end, the party leadership was quite unanimous in devoting top resources to the Air Force and then the Navy, even though they were going to play only a supporting role in the war for China that the CCP expected was going to happen in a matter of months, because they were starting from nearly zero in the air and sea departments. Any progress that they were going to make in the short time that they thought they had was going to have outsized benefits to shaping the land war to come. This meant establishing whole new branches of service that could not have been more foreign from the experience of China's top military leaders and all Chinese military personnel in the Chinese Communist forces, which was dirt war, mostly agricultural, mostly small unit warfare. But these naval and air forces had to be popped up almost like figures in a children's book, as close to overnight as they could. This created some very interesting dynamics and brought out some spectacularly interesting characters. Today, we're going to start with the Air Force. The Chinese Communist Air Force, surprisingly, actually predated the Chinese Communist victory over the whole of the mainland. This is because there was not one Chinese Communist army during the Civil War. There were several. They were regional armies. They were not in a great deal of coordination and communication with each other. They each had their own theaters to fight in, their own set of personalities running the show, and they developed their own distinct methods and even institutional cultures. Now, you and I, at least, outside of China, and I think many Chinese people too, when we think of the Chinese Civil War and we think of the Chinese Red Army, we think of Mao in the deep hinterland of the country, fighting the kind of classic guerrilla war that he would later literally write the textbook on. And that was his laboratory for everything from adapting Marxist-Leninist thought to a peasant subsistence farming society. Versions of what became the classic Maoist approaches to politics and political education, control within the party, agricultural policy, and land reform, the reforming of rural society along the lines that the Chinese Communist Party wanted to see. In short, it was Mao's laboratory. However, even though that's kind of like the marquee version of the Chinese Communist forces in the Civil War, also, there were other regional armies. The one that's very interesting to us today is the Northeast. Manchuria, you'll remember, was a Japanese-occupied puppet state bordering China proper and the Korean Peninsula, which was also a Japanese-occupied colony, ruled directly by Japan and leaving many very, very bitter memories. The fight there, of course, was much different. For one thing, the terrain was different, flat and cold. It was a more multi-ethnic place. Mongols, Koreans, ethnic Manchus, ethnic Chinese, even ethnic Russians lived in the area. The food there is different, the language is different, to a large extent, the culture is different. If you ever need a good conversation starter with Chinese nationals, just ask them, hey, tell me about the difference between Northerners and Southerners, or coastal people and the people of the hinterland. And you'll evoke hours of interesting, lively discussion. We should always remember that China is more like a subcontinent, like India or Europe, of terrific linguistic diversity, culinary diversity, distinct regional histories that branch off and come together with the history of the Chinese world itself as it's united and divided and united and divided. Well, there in the Northeast, there was one other very important variable, the presence of Soviet influence. Up in the Northeast, there was a long history of contact and trade and mutual influence and even migration and intermarriage between what was called the Soviet Far East and the Chinese populations. And the Chinese Communist forces operating in Manchuria were much more able to avail themselves of Russian help, or at least Russian expertise in warfare, than communist forces in any other part of China. Now, we've mentioned before that During the Civil War, the Soviet Union had a another hard to encapsulate relationship with the Chinese Communist Party and the KMT that fluctuated a great deal over the years. But uh, to keep this neat and tidy, let's just say that there were times when the Chinese Communist forces could at least get a fair bit of covert support from the Soviets in the Northeast. Let's begin to get specific about that then. And just to make sure that I give you faith that we're really going somewhere with this, what we're going to see is that the PLA Air Force had its roots in Manchuria even before the Civil War ended. The PLA commander in that region was a fellow named Lin Biao, who is, for my money, one of the most intriguing figures in our story, formidable in many ways, but also strangely weak and timid and hypochondriacal and really just downright bizarre in other ways. For the moment, all that we need to know about Lin Biao is that he spent time in the Soviet Union and he was one of the high PLA leaders who was most in conversation with the Russian military and political establishment and most conversant with their ways of war. This made him one of the very few people in the top leadership ring of the PLA who had direct knowledge of Soviet war fighting. It was under Lin Biao's leadership that even before the Civil War was over, Chinese Communist forces began gathering up the remnants of leftover nationalist or KMT airplanes and aviation personnel and trying to assemble a small fledgling Chinese Communist air transport group. This was the kind of germinal form of the PLA Air Force. And it says a lot about the character of the Chinese Communist forces in Manchuria as approaching something much more like a regular modern military force than their cousin armies in other regions of China, that they could actually have air power, or at least air transport, which is a big force multiplier. Lin assigned the job of marshaling these fledgling forces and the nationalist defectors who were mostly manning them, since the Chinese communists themselves had very few people with even like an eighth grade education, much less people who were trained aviators and air maintenance specialists. So Lin Biao gave the job of supervising and organizing that effort to a fascinating, really gutsy, impressive man named Zhou Baozhong. Zhou Baozhong was a nom de guerre. Many of the communist leaders used noms de guerre. Zhou Baozhong means Zhou, the guy who protects China. He was born in Yunnan province, bordering Vietnam, and somehow or other, he found himself early in life as a guerrilla up in Manchuria in the Northeast. This is like the equivalent of growing up in China's version of Florida and being accustomed to that weather, and then somehow ending up in North Dakota playing Red Dawn and freezing your pigu off. He distinguished himself there, and he was the leader of his own guerrilla band that was part Han and also part Korean, with some very formidable Korean renegades who had fled Japanese-controlled Korea and now were in Japanese puppeted Japanese puppeted Manchuria to fight with Chinese forces against their shared and hated enemy, the Japanese. That's not so very rare, but this is incredible. I've never heard of anything like this before. Zhou's forces were hard up in, I think it was the winter of 1942.
Correction, 1940.
Zhou's band was at the end of their endurance and they needed supplies and they needed a place to rest and refit and refeed until spring. Zhou did what you were not really supposed to do, which was cross into the Soviet Union, hoping that he could have the Soviet authorities turn him a blind eye, since they weren't officially supposed to be harboring communist enemies to the Japanese rulers of Manchuria, diplomatically speaking. What he got was an offer, the likes of which I've just never heard of before. And it's so cool that I'm writing a novel about it. One day, heaven willing, I'll publish this thing. But this is what happened. The Soviet authorities said, I'll tell you what, instead of turning a blind eye and letting you just use this as your base on the down low, why don't we formally induct you and your men into the Soviet army? And that is what they did. Zhou's band was enlisted, or in the case of the leaders, commissioned into the regular Soviet army. And they were given the name as the 88th Independent Brigade. A note on that number, 88. In Chinese, the number 8, ba, sounds a lot, at least to some ears, like the word for get rich, ba. And maybe, I don't know, maybe it's a Cantonese thing. And so 8 or 88 is a very lucky number. And if you ever go to a casino where Chinese-speaking gamblers are present, which is to say, if you ever go to a casino anywhere, keep that in mind, and you'll see the number 88 popping up as a desirable number. Well, Zhou's men were outfitted and trained as regular Soviet soldiers, but much more. Friends, regular Soviet soldiers do not all get parachute training. Every man and woman, everyone in Zhou's brigade jumped. Clearly, the Soviets had something rather special in mind for this unit. What could it have been? It also gave training to individual soldiers in advanced patrolling techniques, radio communications, driving, and if I remember correctly, motorcycles. Maybe I'm making that up. I don't remember.
And also swimming, skiing, climbing, and explosives.
And other skills that were really not on the menu for just every Ivan in the Soviet army. These soldiers were good. Although the Soviet Union was still in a pact of neutrality with Japan, they still would send small units from the 88th across the border on raids against Japanese-occupied Manchuria that were something like training runs, I think. They were blooding the troops, getting them some combat experience, and getting them used to sneaking around behind enemy lines. If you haven't figured it out already, this thing had what would later be called Spetsnaz written all over it. Part of that also was the presence of all these multilingual troops. You had the Chinese-speaking troops, the Chinese nationals, who would also have included ethnic Mongolians and Manchurians. Later, much later, they also got a couple battalions of Poles and Czechs who were shipped over to join this kind of international brigade. But outside of the Chinese nationals, the group to really keep your eye on, and the group that was considered really bad to the bone, were the Koreans. Remember, as I said before, these were guys who didn't just want to fight. They wanted to fight Japanese enough that they escaped Japanese Korea. Then they crossed over into another Japanese area and joined a highly illegal, terribly outgunned, basically unsupplied guerrilla band that operated in a language that they had to learn just so that they could join it. Just by process of self-selection, these guys were people who ate nails and shell fragments in their bibimbap. And we have recollections of the Chinese veterans of these bands who were very formidable people in their own right. Still talking about the Koreans with something of an air of awe. The captain of the Korean battalion was a tall fellow who spoke Chinese quite well and Russian, and he was known as Jin Zheng.
I got that wrong. 今日成.
In Korean, that name is pronounced Kim Il Sung. Yes, that Kim Il Sung was a member of Zhou Baozhong's Spetsnaz band. Let's just call it what it is. It's a Spetsnaz band. So that made him the leader of quite a special battalion in a really quite extraordinary formation. A Korean national from a Japanese occupied country in a different Japanese occupied country who joined a Chinese guerrilla band that joined the Soviet army.
By the way, this is how it came about that Kim Jong-il, the deer leader, was born in the Soviet Union in Khabarovsk. Although there is some scholarly controversy about that. In North Korea, he is documented as having been born on Mount Paektu, the mythical home of the Korean people, under a double rainbow and a shining star.
When the Soviet Union finally declared war on Japan and Manchukuo, the Japanese puppet state, in 1945 and invaded Manchuria, elements of the 88th formed a very important part of the Soviet advance guard. As you might have guessed right now, their purpose was for teams to be airdropped behind the lines in Manchuria in advance of the Soviet motorized and armored spearheads and conduct, I don't know what exactly, intelligence gathering functions, maybe some diversionary stuff, maybe some assassinations, maybe linking up with communist sympathizing leaders in the area. We do know that they were very successful in their assigned missions. We also know that those airdropped troops died like flies. There was an incident in the 1960s where some villagers on a mountainside near the Mudanjiang in Manchuria discovered a mysterious radio out in the woods that had USA engraved on it. The authorities went on high alert, thinking that this meant that KMT operatives were active in the area. Then it just so happened that word of this got to a woman named Wang Yizhi, who had been a captain in the 88th and was the wife of Zhou Baozhong, its commander. And she put the pieces together. That radio belonged not to recent KMT spies or saboteurs. It had been there for close to 20 years. It had belonged to one of those paratrooper teams led by a Korean named Piao Yingshan, who cached their radio as part of their mission and never made it back to retrieve it. Other parts of the 88th accompanied the Soviet motorized ground forces on their very fast advance into Manchuria, which I think probably makes them the first Chinese communist troops to participate in a Soviet-style combined arms operation, which I find endlessly fascinating. That's why I'm writing a novel about it.
Those Chinese troops with the ground forces were acting as translators, guides, scouts, and this is really interesting, air-ground controllers. The thought of controlling close air support in any language, much less my second language, just makes me sweat. After the Japanese surrender, then those Chinese forces were put in place in cities throughout Manchuria to get the Chinese communists started with building governance there before the KMT could come and occupy the place. See our episode before on Soviet political jiggery-pokery in Manchuria in our episode Thanks for Nothing.
Well, after this was over, even before the Civil War was finished, Zhou, who must have become an incredible administrator because he was assigned so many different hats to wear as the Chinese Communist Party was slowly, secretly given as much control as possible over Manchuria before it could be handed back to the KMT. One of his jobs was to oversee this gathering and organizing of the flotsam and jetsam of leftover nationalist airplanes and aviation facilities and aviators and maintenance personnel. And shape them as best he could into a proto-Chinese communist air corps, which he did. Problem was, Zhou, like most Chinese communist officers, had no military professional education of a level anywhere close to what would be needed to do this. I mean, precious few Chinese communist officers anywhere in China had any military education at all. Now, that's maybe I shouldn't go so far as to say precious few. As we'll see, there were plenty of Chinese generals and high-level commanders who had some training formally, maybe through the Soviets, maybe at the old Huangpu, KMT Huangpu Junxiao, the I never know how to pronounce this in English, this weird spelling, the Whampoa Military Academy or the Yunnan Military Academy or one of the other warlord military academies. But they were a minority. Precious few Chinese officers at any level had real military science education. And in fact, precious few had any kind of education. I can't remember if Zhou Baozhong finished the fifth grade or the eighth grade, but that actually made him one of the more formally educated Chinese officers. Again, the the fine grand families of nationalist China were not sending their highfalutin, well-schooled sons and daughters to go join the dirt fighters of the Chinese Communist Party. But that education clearly stood Zhou in very good stead. Their schools back in the old days must have been quite excellent. Well, Zhou needed somebody who really actually had a high level professional military education. And there were a handful of such individuals. I mean, I really wouldn't be surprised if you could count them on the fingers of two hands, maybe even one. Well, Zhou did know very well one of these people. He had become a friend of Zhou's in his days with the 88th Independent Brigade.
Friends, this episode is long, and so in order not to tax your patience, I'm going to declare an intermission rather abruptly in just a moment, and I'll come back with part two very quickly.
As we come to the end of today's episode about the birth of the PLA Air Force, I'd like to extend special thanks to Mrs. 56, who is our political officer. And in the PLA way of organizing things, it's the political officer who is in charge of the soldiers' education, and that includes art and media. And she was the one who gave me the idea and helped me to set up this studio at home, where, unlike my office on campus, I'm at liberty to use the full panoply of Type 56 teaching materials without getting proned out at gunpoint. This is Type 56, the story of the SKS and AK-47 in China. If you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe. There's much more to come.
我就喜欢你，深深的爱上你，在 PLA 里倾听你的声音。